In this video, I'm going to be discussing the epistemology of most atheists and why I think there's a significant flaw in the way atheists reason through their epistemology, and it affects, it has a serious impact on the scientific enterprise as a result. But I want to clarify from the start that I don't believe, like other Christians believe, that atheism is intrinsically irrational. So I think it is logically possible to be a rational atheist. However, I think most atheists are being irrational in the way they reason through their epistemology. And that's something that needs to be addressed. Okay, so coming back to kind of the last few steps of the previous presentation, the atheist epistemology is built on some of the philosophical developments that happened during the Enlightenment and the way these interacted with the scientific revolution. So Descartes introduced this idea that you can have a certain or confident starting point to philosophical reflection if you build on the idea that, you know, I, the self, I exist, because I have to exist to be able to think about things. The problem is, once I establish that starting point, that at least I know for sure that I exist, the next few steps are a little bit iffy, because I need to go further than that to be able to develop any kind of knowledge. And the thing is, I don't know for sure that any of the other stuff is real. So I don't know if other minds exist, because even though I'm talking to people, they could just be like a computer program, for example, like in the Matrix, that was meant to keep my mind entertained. So, you know, maybe you guys listening to this are real or are not. I don't know that, because all I know is that I exist. I don't know if the world is real. I could be in a brain in a computer somewhere, and, you know, I have no idea if everything else is real, following Descartes' reasoning. So in order to be able to move to a place where knowledge can be built scientifically, there's certain steps that need to be taken, and these are usually known as properly basic beliefs. So there's this sort of fuzzy in-between area here where I have to make certain assumptions. You know, I have to assume, obviously, I know that I exist, but I have to assume other minds exist, and I have to assume the world itself exists and it's a real thing. And then I can go from there. So as long as I have this bare minimum set of assumptions that I adopt the properly basic beliefs, then from that point on, I can build my knowledge scientifically. So whatever conclusions I draw, if they're backed by sufficient research, and I can have sufficient confidence in those conclusions, I could say, yeah, that's dependable knowledge, and go from there. And I don't have to rely on other forms of knowledge like philosophical speculation or theology, religion, and so on. All right, so scientific evidence, you know, science makes mistakes, but it's self-correcting, and it's the types of mistakes that science makes are still nowhere near the kind of things that people have made using other supposed ways of knowing. So it's, you know, to most atheists, science is the only trustworthy type of knowledge that human beings can have. And this thought process then is applied to God, because we start with this foundation, you know, Descartes' foundation of a solid foundation. We do have this properly basic beliefs, this very minimal, very basic assumptions that we have to make to move from that starting point to the next stage. And after that, everything is built scientifically, and I don't believe anything unless I can demonstrate it using scientific evidence. And if that's the case, then by the time we get the question of God, well, I have no reason to believe in God either, because I have no scientific evidence that I can provide for God's existence. And God is already a massive claim. I mean, this idea of a omnipotent and omniscient and everything entity that's all powerful and loving, but in the, you know, there's still problems and sins in the world and suffering and all this. That stuff is such a massive claim, and there's no way to demonstrate that scientifically. So basically, there's no point in taking that hypothesis seriously. I mean, you know, we're open to it, so to speak, or an atheist would say, I'm open to the idea of God, but I have no reason to believe it. And really the burden of proof is on the believers to supply me with that kind of evidence. So that's kind of the rationale here. So essentially, atheists tend to be tentative naturalists. So they're naturalists, but they're not making a claim necessarily that that has to be the case. It's just that that's where they are based on the available evidence, all the dependable and trustworthy evidence they have is scientific evidence, and all the scientific evidence so far hasn't given anybody a reason to move beyond naturalism. So that's where they feel like they need to be at. And there's also an aversion to philosophy because, we've had thousands of years of history of people using philosophy to try to understand reality, and they've made mistake after mistake after mistake. Platonism, Aristotelianism. I mean, people using Aristotle believed this Earth was at the center of the universe, and all the things were kind of like being drawn by the Earth, and all these different ideas that were clearly false and clearly didn't work out. So there's been so many scientific mistakes made because people try to use philosophy and philosophical speculation to arrive at truth, and it turned out to be wrong because evidently that method of acquiring knowledge just doesn't work, or it's not effective, or it's not dependable. It's better just to believe the bare minimum you need to believe to get started, and then from that point on just build only scientific knowledge. And whatever you cannot prove scientifically, just don't have an opinion on it or suspend judgment on it until you have scientific evidence for it. But this aversion to philosophy creates a sort of epistemic cul-de-sac, in the sense that you have to do philosophy together, but because you have an aversion to philosophy, you stop at that point, and you don't take the time to think through your own philosophical position far enough to recognize that there might be problems in it. And that's why I said that modern day atheism exhibits the characteristics of a cult, because from an epistemic perspective, they're sort of stuck in this rut where they have certain foundational philosophical assumptions, but they don't allow themselves to revisit or question or evaluate those assumptions, because they have an aversion to philosophy as a way of knowing, and because of that, they're kind of stuck in that process. Nonetheless, in spite of this flaws in the epistemology, atheists seem to be the dominant perspective within the scientific community. Now, of course, people here will always say, like, no, that's not true. There's actually more Christians that are scientists, or theists that are scientists than there are atheists, or at least in some fields. But it doesn't matter, because regardless of how many theists there are, it still seems that they're there only because they subject themselves to the atheist way of thinking. So this atheistic philosophy seems to be the predominant perspective within the scientific community, which is problematic if I'm correct about the fact that this particular perspective is cultish. Like in any given situation, it's not healthy to let the cultish individual be the dominant decision maker in any given setting. And yet it seems like within the scientific community, there's the people that have this problems in their epistemology are running the show. Now, that being said, there's a caveat to that. And I think I would almost be okay, if I had a choice between this and something else, I'd be okay with the atheists running the show, because at least they're protecting science from the danger of slipping back into some of the previous approaches to science that we've had in history that proved to be ineffective, or even bad, or had a detrimental effect on scientific growth. So I don't know if I could say that different, but I could say it's like, having atheists dominate the scientific community is the lesser of several possible evils. So what I'm hoping to accomplish through this series is to try to open the door to move towards something better, as opposed to slipping back into ways of thinking that that were worse than what we have now. And I don't know if that can even be accomplished, but that's what I'm hoping to open up the conversation about. Okay, so let's think about why there's issues with this particular reasoning process that most of today's atheists have. All right, so what are the properly basic beliefs again? I exist, others exist, and the world exists. The problem is these beliefs atheists just take for granted by saying that, look, these are assumptions that everybody has to make. They're a bare minimum set of assumptions. And then from that point on, everything is scientific. But the problem is these assumptions cannot just be accepted as is. Like you cannot just say the world exists and that's it and stop there. If these things are true, then they need an explanation. So I exist. Why do I exist? How did I get here? Other minds exist. How did I get here? The world exists. How did the world get here? This is an unavoidable subsequent question of taking for granted this particular starting assumptions. So if you take for granted that you exist, other people exist, and the world exists, then you automatically take for granted the fact that these things require some explanation of why they exist. So all the viable hypotheses that we can have to explain why these things exist are, as a collection, themselves also properly basic. In other words, unless we can demonstrate that we know how these things came to exist and there's only one possible explanation for them, then other possible explanations have to be taken together and collectively become also a properly basic belief, because these things need an explanation. You can't just take for granted that all these things exist. You have to explain how they came to exist. So basically, there's more or less either two or three possibilities depending on how you sort them. God, supernatural versus natural, and I'll explain this in a bit. So the idea that atheists have today, that the default setting in the way we need to reason about this stuff is to treat naturalism as a kind of a tentative default setting. That's flawed because we don't know. We're taking a step forward without actually knowing or having a reason to go in that direction. The real default in this conversation is we don't know. So if we look at this here, and if I divide the question into two possibilities, everything exists. We all agree that the world exists and that we exist. How did they came to exist? One option is naturalism. So they developed entirely by, reality developed entirely by natural processes. That's one option. And if naturalism was one option, then supernaturalism in all its different forms, that's one other option. Unless we have a way to demonstrate that this option is the correct one, then we have to consider both possibilities. So the default setting here is we don't know, and one option is naturalism, one option is supernaturalism. This is pseudo default is not really a word, but anyway, it makes everyone understands what I'm saying. Because atheists treat tentative naturalism as a default, they have a faulty starting point in their reasoning. Just like pre-moderns were treating supernaturalism as a default setting, there was like tentative supernaturalism, and that was a problem as well. The only real default here is we don't know. And then, of course, once we start at the default and once we decide what our options are, we can talk about the probabilities of each one. And unfortunately, even that, we're limited in what we can say about these probabilities at this point in time. Okay, so here's another way to look at it. I, others, in the world exist. That is something that theists and atheists agree on. So the question is, how did these things came to exist? If we could either break it into natural and supernatural, and that's two different categories, or we could say there's the natural or the material option. The other side is the God option. So, some kind of intelligence, some kind of mind created everything. And any in-between options, so, let's say there's some kind of supernatural that isn't God, maybe like a force, maybe something else. It's not really a mind, it's not really self-aware, intelligent, like a mind, an intelligent entity would be. But at the same time, it's not natural in the sense that we normally understand natural either. So basically, you could break it down into three available hypotheses here that have to be, as a collection, also be treated as properly basic until you can dismiss the other options and only have one option available. So unless somebody could say, okay, this is the right hypothesis, and we have really good reasons to completely dismiss these other options, then all three of them have to be dealt with as being properly basic beliefs, because they need to explain this other three beliefs that you already have. To hold these, you have to also incorporate the answer for why they are there. And atheists just ignore this and just take this thing for granted and say, hey, we're here. Everybody agrees that we're here. From here on, we use scientific evidence, but they kind of skipped over a step. Okay, here's an analogy that kind of explains the difference between the three hypotheses. If we treat the universe as a set, okay, imagine you let's say that you're walking somewhere, and on the ground you see what looks like several pebbles that are basically connected together in a sort of some kind of formation. Okay, so one option to explain why they are in that formation is that these are magnets, and they have intrinsic properties that bring them together, and they're connected to each other because of those intrinsic properties. So their internal attractions are responsible for why these different pebbles came together within this formation. Another option is that they're just regular pebbles, but because of external forces, like maybe there was an earthquake, maybe there was wind, water, whatever, they were brought together into that formation. And that's why they are where they are. And the third option is, some child passed by and saw the pebbles and put them together into a formation. Now, the difference here is obviously that this is intentional. Somebody saw them, decided to do something about them, and arranged them in a particular way. This is unintentional. There's no mind behind it. It just happens through random forces, but the forces are external to the set of pebbles. And then the magnets here, the forces are intrinsic. So basically, if the universe is a set, you could say naturalism represents the hypothesis that the intrinsic characteristics of the universe, so the fundamental constants, the forces like gravity and electromagnetism and all these different things working on matter and energy together, somehow these forces are responsible for the universe becoming what it is and for us coming into existence and all these different things. Or if that doesn't explain the universe, then you need something external to it to explain how we got here, even if not completely. Like, we don't need this external component to build everything exactly the way it is today. It could just have contributed along the way, so that it's a combination of intrinsic forces and external forces working together to bring it together. And finally, if we postulate the possibility of a mind, then this mind can have engineered everything else about our universe and did it intentionally. So those are the three hypotheses, the three options. And these are three possible hypotheses as an explanation for those properly basic elements that we take for granted in our philosophical structure. And we don't have a way to know ahead of time which of these three hypotheses is correct. Okay, now some objections are like, these are things that come up. So somebody might say, hey, you can't just say God because there's many gods, like how do you know it's your God versus the Muslims or the Hindus or something else? And the thing is, that is irrelevant at this point because we're just discussing the generic God. So this could be any kind of God as long as it's some kind of intelligent entity that has the capacity to do whatever else it needs to do to get the universe going. All of them have many different options because, you know, if you say it's not a mind, it's some kind of some other kind of supernatural. It could be some kind of force. It could be one of the Plato or Aristotle's things, and maybe there's just forms that are just there, eternal forms, eternal essences, whatever. There's many different options in the middle. And in the natural setup, you could have just a Big Bang, or you could have a multiverse, or you could have something else. There's options in all of them, but we're just basically classifying them into categories. You know, you have the mind option here, you have the natural option here, you have the in between, something that's neither fully natural, or it's not a mind either. It's not a self-aware thing. It's just some kind of something else. Another thing that people do is like, okay, well, you know, just because you partially got here doesn't explain all the problems in the Bible, you know, Christianity and all these different things. We're not talking about any of that, because those are a whole different set of discussions, like a different category of discussion. To illustrate, you know, it's kind of like when scientists talk about evolution and somebody says, well, what about the first living cell? And scientists will say, hey, abiogenesis is a separate topic from evolution. Don't mix the two. This is kind of like that. The idea of the origin of everything is a different discussion than religion and subsequent religious beliefs. And it can all be categorized into these three groups: mind, natural, or something else. Another thing that usually comes up and atheists bring up is that atheism makes no claim. So atheism is not promoting naturalism or whatever. Atheism is the absence of belief in God and all this stuff. That doesn't matter to this discussion, because as long as somebody accepts those properly basic beliefs, they accept the fact that they exist, that other minds exist, and that the world exists, they have to automatically accept that there's an explanation for this, and they have to propose some kind of hypothesis, or else there's no justification for anything else they do after that point. Like, you know, scientific evidence doesn't mean anything if the world isn't real. So you have to assume the world is real to be able to argue then that scientific evidence is trustworthy. And to assume the world is real, you also assume that the world got here somehow. Okay? So atheism is not a hypothesis. Naturalism could be a hypothesis, or an atheist might say, hey, what I mean when I say I'm an atheist is that I reject category number 3 over here over mind, and I accept the possibility of the other two. And that's fine. So you're saying it's either natural or it's something else besides natural, but it's definitely not a God. You're defending two hypotheses as opposed to the third. That's okay, but one of these three options, everybody that claims, that wants to participate in a scientific discussion, they're already assuming automatically to be able to do anything with science. Again, the default here is there's three options. We don't know which of these three is the correct one. Anytime somebody says one option is more plausible than the other, they're taking a step beyond the starting point, beyond the default, and it's a claim that they need to defend. So you can't say on the one hand, we don't know which of this it is, but on the other hand, you know, prefer one of the options over the other, because the minute you do that, you're actually making a positive claim, and that needs to be defended. And then if you're going to say, okay, there's probabilities for, you know, naturalism is more probable than the other two options, then you have to have a basis for saying that. And the problem is that it's difficult to find that basis. And we'll discuss that in this section. Okay, so now, how do we decide the probabilities? Well, atheists take kind of different approaches to this. So they'll say the naturalistic option it has an intrinsic default status. Because, for example, they might say, okay, here's an example. Let's say you're sitting at home and there's a blackout, or you're sitting at home and your lights turn off. You know, it's dark outside and your lights were on, and then all of a sudden they go off. Now you might say, okay, one option is there's a blackout for my block, you know, a blackout for my block, where the houses in my neighborhood all lost electricity for some reason. Or you might say there's a breaker that needs to be fixed, that broke, and what's the a breaker that burned or that got tripped, and you need to go fix it. Or you might say that the light bulbs burned or something, whatever the explanation is. Your explanations are always natural. You're not going to come up with a supernatural explanation. You're not going to say something like, God turned off my lights, or an angel came by, or a ghost, or somebody in another building across the street used magic to turn off my lights, or anything like that. So natural explanations always have precedence over supernatural explanations. An atheist will argue. So they'll say, hey, there's a natural explanations are intrinsically the default explanations for anything. That's why naturalism is the default perspective, and the other two perspectives need to demonstrate that they're correct before we take them seriously. So that's one of the ways atheists argued with this. And again, I'm saying, no, that's incorrect. The default is we don't know. And each perspective, like when you have a hypothesis, you have to demonstrate that hypothesis. You cannot just take it for granted. When you're within the natural sphere, yeah, a naturalist explanation is the default. But when you step back and you look at the entire thing, how it all came to exist, you have your hypothesis, and you have to argue for your hypothesis. You cannot just take one for granted. And I'll come back to this point in a little bit as well. Another way that atheists, okay, so yeah, I kind of divided this into two objections, but it's mostly the same thing. So one they just treat it as an intrinsically default status. Another one, they'll say it's more probable because that's how we reason through all situations. We assign natural, like we apply a natural explanation to it first. Then another argument is Occam's razor. Occam's razor is basically just saying that when you look for an explanation, go with the simplest explanation, one that makes the least amount of additional assumptions and things like that. So the thing with this is that Occam's razor is a methodological solution to this types of question, not really a philosophical one. So what I mean by that is that if we were to do an experiment, and in this experiment we set up thousands and thousands of scientific experiments and applied Occam's razor to all of them, and we said, okay, let's set up a bunch of experiments of all kinds, apply the Occam's principle to these experiments, and then see if that hypothesis, so like if you have some kind of question and then you have multiple hypotheses and you use Occam's razor to decide which hypothesis to test out first, and then we say, okay, let's see how often using Occam's razor gives us the correct hypothesis. I don't know if anybody's done any experiment like that. I don't know if it's even possible to do it, but chances are that, sometimes Occam's razor will give us the correct hypothesis. Sometimes he'll give us the wrong hypothesis, and one of the more complex explanation turns out to be the correct one. And I don't know what the ratio would be like. Is it that Occam's razor is correct 60% of the time and it's wrong 40% of the time, or something else? I have no idea. But methodologically, it's still the correct principle to use, because you want to go with the simplest explanation, since it often requires the least amount of work. So do that first, eliminate it, and then move to the second hypothesis that is more complex or has additional requirements or additional assumptions to it, and so on. So from a methodology perspective, yeah, if you can apply Occam's razor to something and start with that, that might actually save you time overall. But in terms of which one turns out to be correct, we don't really know if like we don't have a way to demonstrate that this always works. In every single situation, every single experiment, following Occam's razor give us the right answer. If that was the case, then we wouldn't need to do experiments. We would just apply Occam's razor to every single question. So let's say, and again, this is hypothetical. I'm pretty sure that it's not even really possible to apply this to every possible situation. But if we did such an experiment and we discovered that applying Occam's razor works 70% of the time, and the other 30% of the time, it turned out that the weaker explanation is the one that, or the less likely explanation was the correct one, then we would have a 70% to 30% ratio. So then we could go back here and say, out of these three hypotheses, maybe naturalism is the simplest option. Then this one would have 70% likelihood, and this one would have 30%. These other two would have 30% likelihood, but 30% is still a lot. So from a scientific standpoint, if there's a 30% likelihood that these other hypotheses are correct, it has implications for everything else we do in science, because 1 in 3 is a significant ratio. Okay, I'm just making that up because I don't have any idea what the ratio would be. But if it is a significant chunk, like 30%, then it has implications regardless of whether this one is more probable. Okay, so assuming Occam's razor could even be approached from this angle and applied to the question of probabilities regarding the very nature of how things came to exist, it would still not completely do away with the other hypotheses. Another thing that people bring up is the idea of the God of the gaps, and I'll address that in the next slide. And finally, they bring up the claim that the success of science is evidence for naturalism, because in the past, people believed in a supernatural world where the majority of the stuff around us was magical and enchanted and things like that. And scientists came up with natural solutions, and eventually it turned out that those solutions were correct. So that should be taken as evidence for science. And again, I'll come back to that in the next slide or a future slide. All right, so coming back to this three hypotheses at the very beginning. The question is, regardless of which hypothesis you work with, if you go all the way back, as far back as you can imagine, at some point in time, you're left with a series of choices. And one of the choices is to say that there was nothing there, nothing existed, and then at some point in time, something came into existence out of nothing. So that's an option. It might not be a rational option, but that is one option. So one is something from nothing. Another one that I didn't mention here is the option of infinite regress, and I'll explain that as well. And then the third option is that something always existed. So if you think back all the way, regardless of whether you're a naturalist or a supernaturalist, if you think back all the way to the very beginning, how did this whole thing get started? Either something came out of nothing, or something came out of something else, which came out of something else, which came out of something else, going infinitely back, so infinite regress, which is probably just as nonsensical as something coming out of nothing, or something always existed, infinitely back in time, which is hard to comprehend as well, but might be slightly better than the other two options. Or time has a beginning, so there was, time didn't go back indefinitely, it just started somewhere. But then the question is why? How did time just start out of nothing? Or there is no such thing as time, so reality is timeless, and we're just imagining time, or we're perceiving time, but it doesn't actually exist. And that has its own issues as well. So all these different options, essentially, no matter what hypothesis you go with, if you go back far enough, you run into this beginning point, which is logically very confusing. Like it's hard to explain how things started, how things came out of nothing, if they came out of nothing, or how infinite regress doesn't make sense. something always existed, again, is hard to comprehend, but that might be an option. And then, if you don't like any of these three options, maybe there's something else that we haven't thought of, but more or less, these are all the different options people have come up with so far. Now, a lot of theists will say, okay, the only logical option here is that something always existed, and that something has to be God, because God is going to be the prime mover, like he starts everything, and then everything else goes from there. But the reality is, it doesn't necessarily have to be God. Maybe the thing that always existed was just something natural, and then the rest of the natural universe developed from that one thing that always existed. So the one thing that always existed could be God, it could be something else, or it could be just something natural. Now, the naturalistic option that atheists usually go with has some other challenges as well. So, for example, one is the way energy works. So, our universe, as we understand it right now, is similar to one of those old wind-up toys. So, if any of you grew up back in the day like I did, you could get some kind of toy car, and it has this thing that you wind up, and you wind it all the way as far as it goes because it has a spring, and then you let it go, and then it just goes down the carpet, and eventually the spring unwinds itself, and then the car stops because it ran out of energy. Our universe is kind of like that, because you start with this big bang, at least the way scientists view it right now. And then over time, over billions of years, it's going to get to a place where it's going to eventually die, so to speak. And scientists call this heat death, because all the available energy kind of converts to heat energy, and it's not usable to do work anymore. So the question is, if that's the direction everything is going, how did it start? Where did that initial energy come from? So then you end up postulating something like a multiverse, or something like a big bang and a big crunch, and this back and forth. But it ends up kind of repeating the same issues, because if you postulate a multiverse, well, where did the initial energy for that come from, and so on. So I'm not putting this out there as defeaters of the naturalist perspective. I'm just saying it has its own complication. It has its own difficult questions that need to be addressed. The fine-tuning argument, I'm not a fan of the fine-tuning argument to the extent that most theists use it, because I think that, okay, I'll use my go-to example for this. If you have a glass sphere, and then you have 4 screws that are keeping the sphere suspended in space. So if you have, the screws that are equally distant to each other and positioned in 3-dimensional space in such a way that they keep the sphere in place. So either they don't crush the sphere, but at the same time, they don't allow it to leave and to float out into space. Now, if you took a screw and you tighten it slightly, that would take the glass sphere and crush it, right? But if you untighten it, they will create just enough space for the sphere to float out. So this creates kind of a perfectly fine-tuned system, because all the spheres, all the screws are tied to the exact amount to hold the sphere in space. But if you unscrew one of the screws a little bit, and then you tighten the other 3, then you create another fine-tuned system that also allows for the sphere to be suspended in space. So the fine-tuning argument is that, there's a set of constants that our universe relies on, and to function, they're very precisely tuned. And if it was just slightly off, the universe would collapse, or it wouldn't work the way it works. But the possibility exists that there are other fine-tuned systems that might work as well. So this becomes a kind of a probability argument. Yes, fine-tuning is a problem for naturalists, but it's not as big a problem as most theists make it out to be. And yet it doesn't mean that it's not a problem at all. So, it's just something that the naturalist hypothesis needs to find a way to address. So you cannot just say, hey, this perspective, the naturalist perspective, is the one that is the right one, because everything is clear and everything makes sense and it doesn't have any problems. Another thing to another way I think about this idea of the naturalist perspective is that if you think about the universe, you can imagine many different versions of the universe, and some of those versions are of such a nature that they could never develop on their own. So, in other words, you can conceive of some version of the universe that it's the kind of universe that cannot exist without some external element interfering with the development of this universe. It's of such a nature that it can never develop on its own. So the possibility exists that some universes cannot ever develop on their own in a certain configuration. The thing is, we don't know if our universe is that kind of universe or isn't, because we don't even have a very good knowledge of our universe. We have very little access to the universe. We can only see a small percentage of what's out there to even be able to consider whether we're in a universe that is capable of developing on its own or not. So anyway, we're in no position to definitively say that the naturalist paradigm is the correct one. There's three hypotheses, and we cannot dismiss the other two as of yet. So because of that, all three are still in play. And all three start with a very confusing beginning point, a very difficult to explain beginning point. Again, it's clear that we cannot just dismiss them and say naturalism is definitely the way to go. Now, what about the God of the gaps argument? To me, the God of the gaps argument is a very badly used argument. There's some settings where it's valid, but in 90% of the types of settings it's used, it's a very poorly thought out argument that it's more of a rhetoric type of argument. It's a rhetorical type of argument intended to cause a reaction more than to actually have value, in the sense that it's a legitimate argument to make. So let me kind of explain why I say that. Imagine that there's a bike race, and this bike race, and I'm going to use my part of the world here. Hopefully people are familiar with the geography where I'm at. So, I'm in Southern California. So let's say there's a race going from Los Angeles to the Inland Empire. So Los Angeles is, close to the West Coast, close to the Pacific Ocean. And let's say there's a bicycle race, and people are starting in LA and riding the bikes all the way somewhere into the Inland Empire. Now, all along the route, there's people with their cell phone cameras taking videos of the race and uploading it to the cloud somehow. And, after the race is over, let's say you participate in the race and you go tell your friend, hey, I was just in this bike race from LA to the Inland Empire, and your friend says, hey, I don't believe you. I don't think you're in any shape to be in a bike race. I seriously doubt that you actually rode your bike all the way from Los Angeles to this, to San Bernardino or someplace like that. And the person says, hey, you don't have to believe me. There's videos, because there were bystanders all along the route, and they took cell phone videos of the entire thing. And if we merge the videos together, you can see me going from one place to another. So let's say everybody uploaded the videos to the cloud, and then somebody goes through and merges all the little segments of the video together, and you end up with video evidence for about 90% of the race. And then there's this fragments in different places along the route that there was nobody filmed you with their cell phone. So, there's little tiny chunks here and there that there's no video evidence for. But your friend says, hey, you don't have 100% video evidence, so I'm not going to believe you because there's these little gaps. That's the kind of situation where a God of the gaps argument would make sense, because, you have all this evidence, but then there's this little chunks that haven't been supplied, and then the person says, no, I'm still skeptical because you don't have 100% evidence to prove your claim. Then it makes sense. But imagine the same race, and the person is claiming not to go from LA to San Bernardino or somewhere in the Empire. They're claiming to go from LA to London, to ride their bike from LA to London, but they still only have that video evidence that the previous scenario had. They have sufficient evidence for about 90% of the pathway from LA to San Bernardino, but very little for the rest of the race. In that situation, you cannot apply the God of the gaps argument anymore, because it's the video evidence that's the gap in a sea of so much more for which there is no evidence, or there's very little evidence to supply. And that's the kind of scenario we're with when it comes to our existence. We know very little compared to all the other stuff that we need to know to make a case for any one of these three hypotheses. So the God of the gaps argument just doesn't work in this situation. It's a very bad argument to use here. Okay, so the final thing that people say is the success of science. They say, look, people used to think lightning was, the wrath of the gods, and they used to think that earthquakes were caused by the gods or other supernatural forces and all this stuff. But then today we have scientists, and scientists have figured out how all this stuff works, and there's a natural explanation for all of it. Okay. So when it comes to that issue, there's two different areas to which this applies. One is how things work. So, for example, what makes a tree grow? What makes animals and people function? What causes volcanoes? What causes weather? Those kinds of things. How do things work? But the second question is, how did they come to exist? Where did people come from? Animals, plants, the earth, the planets, and so on. So those are two different categories of things. One is how they operate and how they came to exist. When it comes to how things work, we can probably say that, if we had a scale here where 0% meant it was 100%, 0% meant that it was totally natural, 100% meant that it was fully supernatural. So, what causes a volcano? The cause is natural. That means there's 0% supernatural interference. There's nothing from the outside that needs to step in to cause a volcano to form. Pretty much for most of what we know about reality, we can probably say that there's probably need for 0% supernatural interference for anything to work. So essentially, the world around us is like a machine. If it was set in place by somebody, by some intelligent entity, they did such a good job at it that once they got it going, it runs on its own. So and there's, like I said, there's Christians who are dualists, so there's people that still will contradict this idea because they believe there's another layer to reality. I personally would say, like, at this point in time, we could probably safely say that everything works. The explanation for how everything works is contained in itself. There's a natural explanation for it. We don't need to postulate supernatural interference here. But the next question is, how did it come to exist? And to this question, yes, we've come up with natural explanations for a lot of stuff, but there's still quite a ways to go. And wherever, I don't know exactly where this knob would be on this scale, more to the middle, more to the bottom here, but there's still quite a bit of stuff where we don't have an explanation for it. And it's possible that there was still supernatural interference or supernatural intervention that made it that explains how it came to exist. So naturalism, the naturalist hypothesis here, claims that there was 0% interference from anything else. Everything that exists is completely natural from beginning to end. But in making that claim, what they're claiming is that it's possible for everything else to develop on its own from beginning to end, to come into existence and to work on its own. So the naturalist claim is the one that's making the highest claim here. So, for example, if somebody says God came and did some stuff at the beginning and got things going, and then everything else developed on its own after that, and now it works on its own. that is a lesser claim than the claim the naturalist is making, because the naturalist already agrees that it's possible for everything to develop on its own. So if it's possible for everything to develop on its own, it necessarily has to also be possible for at least some of it to develop on its own, while the rest of it was done by God. So because the naturalist already says all this stuff is possible, any claim made by a theist, it's at least logically possible. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm not sure how else to explain it. But in this situation, the highest or the most demanding claim here is the one made by the naturalist. So any lesser claim that a theist might make and say there was some degree, like there was 5% divine interference or 10% divine interference, and then everything else developed on its own, the naturalist has to agree that it's possible for 90%, for the 90% to develop on its own, because they're saying 100% developed on its own. So anyway, hopefully that makes sense. Anyway, the point of this slide is that the success of science is compatible with more than one view. So sure, we can dismiss the picture of reality that people had in the Dark Ages, or that people have in parts of the world today that still believe in like a supernatural reality. We can dismiss this thing and say, okay, we don't need the supernatural to explain how things around us work, but we haven't yet demonstrated that the entire thing can have developed naturally. So a scenario where either some kind of supernatural element or some kind of supernatural mind stepped in and interfered with this process and contributed to this process, those scenarios are still in play, because we haven't yet explained everything. We haven't yet explained all of existence naturally. So the success of science, all it's really saying to us is that if God exists and if God created reality, he created it where he only did part of it, and then he made it in such a way that the rest of it can happen on its own. It doesn't prove naturalism. It just proves a version of theism, or it allows for both the naturalist option or another option where there was some degree of interference, and then the rest was allowed to develop naturally. So this concept that a lot of atheists have, that if a God exists, he would have created things a certain way, and the fact that he didn't create them that way, that means he doesn't exist. That's just bad theology. There's no reason to think that if a God exists, he would only have created things a certain way. He could have very easily created a universe, and he created the foundational elements and made it in such a way so that everything else can develop on its own. There's no logical reason to dismiss that as a possibility. If we were going to create a universe, and I'm going to discuss this in a bit, let's say we were going to build a universe on the computer, we could very well decide to build it to where we give it certain parameters and then let it develop on its own. There's nothing stopping us from doing it that way. So this whole concept of the success of science being proof or evidence for naturalism is just a poorly thought out argument. And in fact, every single thing that we've discussed here, the different objections that atheists usually bring up, they're all bad arguments. So the arguments they use to say that either the naturalist option is the only viable options and we don't need to consider the other ones, or that it's highly more probable than the other ones, all these the different arguments that they present are not very, very solid arguments. They haven't really been thought out very well. And because of that, the three hypotheses still stand and are still need to be taken into consideration. Okay, so moving on, I want to introduce this other element to the conversation, just in case somebody wants to bring this up later. When scientists do their work, they often develop some kind of tangible model that they use so that they can kind of test out their ideas as they think through different possibilities. So this is a picture of Watson and Crick, who developed or who figured out the double helix arrangement of DNA. So they use kind of like this Lego looking things, and they actually build a double helix so they could kind of look at the interactions and how things would behave within this format and compare that to the experimental results that we're getting, just to help conceptualize the process. So the question I have is it possible to create some kind of conceptual model for the issues that are being discussed in this conversation between theists and atheists, different versions of reality as different people imagine it? And I'll propose that at this point in time, we do have something that we can develop as a conceptual model, and that is the idea of a simulated reality within a computer. We have today all kinds of video games like Minecraft, for example, where people kind of live their lives in this alternate universe and they build different things like that and so on. But imagine something way more advanced than that, where we have a super advanced computer and we actually build a world that replicates the real world. So we build it by having a set of fundamental constants, electromagnetism, gravity, nuclear, strong nuclear, and so on. All these different forces that are our own universe, the way we understand it. Let's assume that we have a much better understanding of our universe than we have today, and then we replicate the whole thing within a simulated environment. And we even develop conscious entities within that environment, but the consciousness is not a product of the computer, but it's a product of the elements within the reality. So there's atoms that form molecules, and those molecules get together and form organs and things like that, and they form a brain, and the brain has processes that are able to produce consciousness, just like the human brain can, in the way the atheist views reality. So essentially what I'm saying is that if the naturalist perspective is correct, we should at some point in time get sophisticated enough in our technology that we could actually replicate reality within a computer simulated environment and create a situation where virtual beings are floating through space on a virtual planet, and they become self-conscious because of interactions within virtual molecules in the virtual brain, just like we are in the real world. And just thinking about this, just conceptualizing such a situation allows us to have a model of a kind of reality that is a subset of a different reality. So one of the issues that people have had in discussing, the supernatural and the natural is basically this idea that how would the physical world or the supernatural world interact with the physical world? There has to be some kind of causal closure within the natural world where things outside the system are not allowed in because it changes things. But if you look at it from the perspective of a simulated reality, none of that matters because we do this all the time. I mean, computer programmers are constantly tampering with games like Minecraft, for example. They do an update and they just do a data dump and the whole game changes in some respect, but people keep playing. It doesn't affect the reality. I mean, there's visible changes, obviously, but it's not like it's impossible for the programmer to make changes to the system once he built the system. He could keep updating it and changing it just the same. So this idea that there has to be a disconnect between the supernatural and the natural, it doesn't really have any basis in anything because we work with this kind of stuff all the time. The other point of this illustration is to say that there's one more complication to the naturalist way of thinking, because first of all, there's the possibility, the hypothesis of God. Then there's the hypothesis of the supernatural, which might not be an intelligent entity, but it's still something different than the natural universe. But then there's also the capacity that we're at the probability or the possibility that we're actually in a simulated reality right now. So let's just say the naturalist is correct that initially, things developed over time through natural processes, evolution, all this stuff, it came to intelligent entities, but these entities got advanced enough to where they built a computer and they replicated the reality within the computer, and we're actually living in the simulation. So even if you accept the naturalist paradigm, it doesn't mean that we're living within the primary, that initial naturalist version of reality. We could be within the first simulation or even a second or third simulation, because each simulation can build its own simulation and so on. So anyway, the point of this is that the hypothesis, the naturalist hypothesis that people work with that come from an atheist perspective, is just one possibility among other possibilities. But if we allow for other possibilities, then it affects how we think about science. And yet people never do that. They never take into consideration the implications for our scientific methodology if we allow for other possibilities, because they approach things from this tentative naturalism default state, and essentially dismiss other options until there's evidence for it. But there's no rational reason to do that. We cannot assign defaults to hypotheses unless we have some reason to treat it as a default. And there's no way for us to know that. We have no prior knowledge based on which to assign default status to any one of these hypotheses. Okay, so this is why atheists' epistemology is flawed, and because of their dominant role in the scientific community, they're affecting the way the whole scientific process works. And again, I need to emphasize that I personally would prefer this state of things versus the state of things we were in before atheists took over the scientific enterprise. But what I'm hoping to do is to see if we can actually move forward and come up with something even better, without putting ourselves at risk of regressing into the previous way of things. Because there's a lot of forces in society trying to move us back towards the way things used to be prior to the scientific revolution. All right, so in conclusion, I would say modern atheism has a naive epistemology. Because of their aversion to philosophy, they never have a chance to recognize the flawed reasoning of their epistemology, because they don't consider philosophy as a legitimate way to reason through their stuff. But they're already doing philosophy, whether they admit it or not, to get to the point where they are to even be able to do science. So because of that, they're stuck in this catch-22. It's an epistemic cul-de-sac, and it's affecting how they think about everything else. Essentially, they're functioning in a modern reality when we live in a postmodern world, and they're not really addressing that issue. And they have control over the scientific enterprise, and it's affecting the way science is done. Theists, even though there's quite a number of theists that are involved in this, are participants in the scientific enterprise, they, for whatever reason, continue to subject themselves to this atheist epistemology, or at least show themselves to be willing to go along with it, to be included and to be allowed to participate. And this whole way of thinking really is cultish, as is any situation where people have a faulty epistemology and then lack the ability to deal with that epistemology. Now, with all that being said, I think theists have their own problems. And in the next video, I'm going to discuss the issues with the theistic paradigm and why I think there's problems with that as well.